Welcome back to chapter 11, Nervous System Divisions, where we are going to start this video discussing the cerebellum. So we already talked about some ways that the nervous system is divided. We talked about the parts of the cerebrum. Now we're going to discuss different other parts of the brain. Namely, we're going to begin with the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is inferior to the occipital lobes. So the cerebellum will be on the posterior aspect of the brain, inferior to the occipital lobes of the cerebral hemispheres. It is dorsal to the pons and the medulla oblongata. The cerebrum is also divided into two hemispheres that are separated by the falx cerebelli. To connect the two aspects of the cerebellum, you have the vermis connecting the two halves of the cerebellum. The cerebral cortex is made up of gray matter. So the outer portion of the cerebrum is gray matter. The inner portion or the medial portion of the cerebellum is white matter. We call that the arbor vitae. Arbor meaning tree, vitae meaning life. They call this the tree of life because of the way it looks. We'll look at it in just a moment, but it contains all white matter. You also have the cerebellar peduncles, the dentate nucleus, which is the largest nucleus in the cerebellum. Make sure that you are understanding. Look up the definition of nucleus with respect to the brain, because a nucleus in a cell is not the same as a nucleus in a brain. What is meant by a nucleus? Please look that up. All right, so the cerebellum also integrates sensory information concerning positions of the body parts. In other words, when your body parts move, you are sitting in a chair and you lift your lower leg. That is a change of position of a body part. So your brain, your cerebellum specifically, will integrate that information about that body part changing positions so that you always know where the different parts of your body are in space. When it was flexed, your feet were on the ground. If you're sitting in a chair and as it's extended, those toes are no longer on the ground, it is in front of you. So change of body position. The cerebellum coordinates skeletal muscle activity. So it's not that it helps the skeletal muscles move, but what it does is it coordinates those movements so that you can actually function. Helps you to maintain posture. Recent studies suggest that there are other roles of the cerebellum. They are still studying those roles, so it's still in development, but these are not the only functions of the cerebellum research is finding. So cerebellum is this organ in the posterior aspect of the brain. It is inferior to the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. It is posterior to the brain stem. There are two halves, so this is one hemisphere, this is another hemisphere. And then when you cut it open and you look into it, you can see that the cortex is this gray matter, lots and lots of cerebral cortex, and the white matter is this information in the middle, or this structure in the middle that looks like the trunk and branches of a tree, which is why they call it the tree of life. So white matter creates the arbor vitae. Go back. All right. Okay. So EEG, electroencephalogram. When you break this word down, a gram is a recording. Remember, cephalo refers to the head. Encephalo refers to the brain. Electro refers to electricity or electrical charges. So the electroencephalogram is the machine that records electrical activity of the brain. It records the electrical changes in the extracellular fluid of the brain. So just like the EKG or the ECG, that is the electrocardiogram, and in those cases, cardio can be spelled with a K or a C. Electrocardiogram records the electrical activity of the heart. This is specific to the brain, encephalo. It's referring to what's going on in the brain. It is recording the brain waves that are occurring at different stages of human existence, whether you're conscious or unconscious. So these are the different waves that it is recording: alpha, beta, theta, and delta. And as you can see, each of those waves occurs in at different states of consciousness at different levels of development in the body. And this is an example of the recordings of an EEG. So now let's talk about the spinal cord. Remember that the spinal cord is a continuation of the brain stem as the medulla oblongata extends inferior and goes through the foramen magnum. It becomes the spinal cord. And it is located inside of the vertebral canal. The spinal cord begins at the foramen magnum, terminates at the level of L1 to L2, so the first and second lumbar vertebrae. So that space where the first and second lumbar vertebrae is located, somewhere in that area, you'll find the end of the spinal cord. The spinal cord consists of 31 segments. If you remember the cranial nerves, there were 12 cranial nerves, and there are now 31 spinal nerves bilaterally. So remember, just like the cranial nerves, the spinal nerves, there is a left one and a right one. So one comes out of each side of each level. So they're in pairs coming out of each level. Spinal nerves are grouped according to the level of the vertebra with which they are associated. So your spinal nerves are going to exit the vertebral canal through the intervertebral foramina, and these intervertebral foramina are between two vertebrae. So whichever foramina the spinal nerve goes through, then that is basically the name of it. So if you have the foramina between, say, vertebrae C7 and T1, then that will be a T1 vertebra. Yes, that should be a T1 spinal nerve. So again, it is named for the level of the vertebrae with which it comes out through that intervertebral foramina. Within each group of spinal nerves, the pairs of nerves are numbered in sequence from superior to inferior, just like the vertebrae are numbered from superior to inferior. So you have going from the most superficial to the most, I'm sorry, going from the most superior to the most inferior, you have vertebrae C1 through C7, then you have T1 through T12, and you have L1 through L5. Just like those are named in that way, so are the nerves of the spinal cord. So let's talk about the portions of the spinal cord. When you do a longitudinal section, you have the cervical and lumbar enlargements. When you look at the spinal cord, you'll notice that there's a bulge at the cervical area and a bulge at the lumbar area. These are the nerves that supply the upper and lower limbs respectively. Think about the fact that you need lots and lots of nerve innervation to give your fingers the dexterity that they have, to have those fine motor movements of your fingers and your wrist, to have all the feeling, the very sensitive nature of our fingertips, to supply the lower limbs, to be able to balance us, to be able to help us move, to be able to wiggle your toes. All of that takes extra nerve innervation. And so the spinal cord is enlarged or bigger in those areas because you have more of those nerves leaving or in that spinal cord and then leaving that spinal cord to give you all of the fine movement and feeling that you have in your upper and lower limbs. You have the conus medullaris, the middle cone. This is the tapering region below the lumbar enlargement. So the lumbar enlargement is obviously in the lumbar area. We already know that the vertebrae, the spinal cord ends at L1, L2. So at the beginning of the lumbar vertebrae is the end of the spinal cord. So just at inferior to that lumbar enlargement, you have the conus medullaris, where it is the tapering off of the spinal cord. The filum terminale is a cord of connective tissue that anchors the spinal cord to the coccyx. So instead of having the spinal cord just moving around any way that it wants to, shrinking up, coming down, like moving, doing whatever movement it would do if it were not tethered, the filum terminale, or the end filament, the ending filament, is the cord that anchors the spinal cord in place, and it anchors it to the coccyx. Then you have the cauda equina. So we said that the conus medullaris is where the spinal cord tapers off, but you still have those nerves that need to innervate the lower body beyond L1, L2. So your lower limbs, your all the muscles in your lower limbs. And those nerves that are not uh, bound together or held together as a spinal cord are just loose nerves, and they call that the cauda equina. Cauda equina translates to horse's tail. So when you look at the cauda equina, it's a bunch of individual nerves that looks like a horse's tail. So group of lumbar and sacral nerves extending downward from the conus medullaris in the vertebral canal. So lumbar and sacral nerves. So looking here, you have the posterior view of the brain stem and spinal cord. This is what the cervical enlargement looks like to go ahead and innervate the fingers, the wrists, the touch, the movement, fine movement, fine sensation of the fingers, wrists, toes, arms, etc. And then you have another enlargement for the lumbar region that helps you with the all of the things we can do with our legs, ankles, feet, toes. Conus medullaris, tapered end of the spinal cord. And then you have the cauda equina, which is the individual nerves that extends beyond L1, L2 to innervate the rest of the lumbar and sacral region. And then here you notice this dura mater that is protecting the spinal cord. Dura mater extends down and becomes the filum terminale that connects to the coccyx and helps to tether or anchor the spinal cord. Functions of the spinal cord. You have two main functions of the spinal cord. You have spinal reflexes, and then you have impulses passing through it. So reflexes, first first function. And then it is a conduit. Conduit basically means pathway. So it is a conduit for for impulses to and from the brain. So sensory information going to the brain, motor information coming from the brain. The spinal cord receives all of this information from the periphery and brings it up, or it takes information from the brain after it's interpreted and processed and interpreted some information, sends it back down to the body parts through the spinal cord. So let's talk about reflexes and reflex arcs. A reflex is an automatic subconscious response to a stimulus within or outside of the body. Subconscious, meaning you are conscious, you are awake, but you are not paying attention to and creating the reflex response. So this something happens, and then automatically your brain responds with a particular response, even though you are awake. Reflexes maintain homeostasis by controlling certain involuntary processes. So in order for you to be able to maintain your blood flow throughout the body, even if there's a change in water volume or a change in change in fluid volume of the blood, your heart rate can respond in accordingly. You're able to cough, right, to make sure that nothing remains in your air passage that could compromise your ability to inhale and exhale. So those are some of the involuntary processes that the spinal cord helps to monitor in order to maintain homeostasis. A reflex arc. A reflex arc is a neural pathway that consists of a receptor, a sensory receptor, at least a sensory receptor and two or more neurons, and then the effector. So the receptor can be that neuron, or it may be another structure, but it's the receptor or receptor portion of a neuron, the neuron, and then the effector. That is the reflex arc. A simple reflex arc only contains two structures. It contains a sensory neuron, a motor neuron, and they synapse with one another instead of synapsing with a third or multiple neurons in order for that reflex to occur. The most common reflex arc contains sensory neuron, interneuron, and motor neuron. So most common will contain three different types of neurons. Sensory neuron taking information to the central nervous system, interneuron in the central nervous system to process that information, motor neuron to send a signal to carry out the decision of the central nervous system. That is the most common reflex arc, but the most simple reflex arc is the same thing without the interneurons. You should remember this drawing. I drew this in the beginning of chapter 10, the first chapter or last chapter that we talked about the basics of the nervous system. So here is a diagram of how a reflex or how a impulse moves throughout the body. The receptor receives the information. It sends that information to an afferent neuron. Afferent neuron goes to the central nervous system where it encounters a interneuron. Interneuron processes and decides if something should be done, and when it decides something should be done, sends that information to an efferent neuron, and eventually it connects to an effector that carries out the action. This is the exact same thing. It just has more details associated with it. You have the receptor that is receiving information. Receptor sends that information to an afferent neuron, carries it to an interneuron. Interneuron processes and then decides whether something needs to be done. Once it decides something needs to be done, it sends information to an efferent neuron that sends the information to an effector to carry out the action that was decided. Reflex behavior. So you have a monosynaptic reflex, which is the stretch reflex. So monosynaptic, mono meaning one, synaptic pertaining to a synapse or that connection between a neuron and another cell. So monosynaptic reflex is a stretch reflex. The reason it only has one synapse is because it only contains two neurons, a sensory neuron and a motor neuron, and those two neurons are connecting at a synapse. And since those are the only two neurons associated with the stretch reflex, there's only one synapse, making it monosynaptic. So that patellar reflex that we did in lab, where you got hit with the reflex hammer and your lower leg on the reflex, you got hit with the reflex hammer on the patellar tendon, and the quadriceps muscle contracted in response, causing the lower leg to extend. That is that knee-jerk reflex of the patellar reflex. That is a stretch reflex because when we hit the patellar tendon, that caused a stretch in not only the tendon, but it also pulled on the muscle to create a stretch in the muscle, and the reflex was that contraction. The monosynaptic stretch reflex also helps us to maintain upright posture. So let's say that you are standing up and the wind blows and it pushes you to the right. That means that your left side is being stretched. So those stretch reflexes on your left side, in the muscles on your left side, are being are stimulated because of the wind blowing. And so the stretch reflex part is those muscles that were then stretched contracts, and this contraction allows you to stand up straight again. So that is an example of how that monosynaptic reflex will help you to maintain upright posture. The withdrawal reflex. The withdrawal reflex occurs when a person touches or steps on something painful. So if you touched a tack, you stepped on the hot concrete, either way it goes, it's painful, your body doesn't like it. And so it withdraws those body parts from that danger. This withdrawal reflex helps you to prevent tissue damage, or at least limit the tissue damage, by removing the limb from that stimulus, from that insult, from that cause of damage and danger. You have polysynaptic withdrawal reflexes. Remember, poly means more than one or multiple. So polysynaptic, that is where you have more than two neurons, right? Because if you only had two neurons, you'll have a monosynaptic reflex. This is polysynaptic, which means more than one. So you have a sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron. Between the two, like if there's only these three neurons, you'd have two synapses. If you had more sensory neurons connected to one another or more interneurons connecting, then you'd have more synapses than just the two. Reciprocal innervation. Reciprocal innervation occurs during a withdrawal reflex and allows the flexors to contract and the extensors to be inhibited. So think about it this way. Flexors and extensors are muscles that do opposing actions. And at any given time, depending on the desired action, these muscles will either contract or relax to allow that action to occur. So when we are reaching out to the hot stove, our extensor muscles are activated, allowing our arm to extend. But as soon as we touch something hot, the body says we don't like it, we need to move our hand really quickly. It deactivates the triceps muscle, which is the extensor muscle on the arm. It activates the biceps muscle, which is the flexor muscle on the arm, so that then the arm can flex, because if the flexor and the extensor were stimulated at the exact same time, at the exact same intensity, your arm would be paralyzed because opposing actions are occurring. So with reciprocal innervation, The flexors will contract, the extensors are inhibited, allowing you to retract or remove your hand or foot from the damage. Crossed extensor reflex. The crossed extensor reflex occurs during the withdrawal reflex. So I just touched a hot stove. My arm is withdrawing my hand and lower arm away from the hot stove. So um, the flexors on the affected side, so the ipsilateral side, will contract. This is why I'm able to withdraw my hand, because my biceps, which is the flexor muscle on the ipsilateral side of the heat or the damage, the flexors will contract, the extensors will be inhibited, so the triceps will be inhibited, so I can withdraw my hand. This is what the withdrawal reflex is. At the same time, on the opposite side, the extensors are contracted and the flexors are inhibited. So let's say that I withdraw my hand because my right hand is touching the stove. So I withdraw that, but my left hand, the biceps is inhibited and the triceps is contracted. So let's say I am stepping back, but I'm holding my arm out so that I don't fall. So I hold my arm out and I grab a table, or hold my arm out and I grab a wall. Or if you look at the leg on the affected side will contract to move away, but on the opposite side, the contralateral side, the leg will be straight so that I don't fall. All right, so that is the crossed extensor reflex. The ipsilateral side, you're able to withdraw, whereas the contralateral side, it's opposite actions of the ipsilateral side, because it's allowing you um to respond without falling. All right, so body can shift weights to the unaffected side so that you can remain upright. That is the crossed extensor reflex. When you're looking at the brain and the spinal cord, remember you have tracts. Tracts are bundles of neurons that are heading in the same direction, basically. You have ascending tracts and descending tracts. Ascending tracts are moving up toward the brain. This is always sensory information. And then you have the descending tract that is moving from the brain to the body. That's always going to be motor information. So now let's talk about ALS. ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, also called Lou Gehrig's disease, also called motor neuron disease, because it is a degeneration of the motor neurons in both the brain and the spinal cord, different parts of the brain, so brainstem, cerebral cortex, degeneration of motor neurons in the spinal cord. The reasons why these motor neurons are degrading can be multiple different reasons. One, it can be overactive microglia. Remember, microglia is one of the neuroglial cells that help the neurons to function. In this case, when the microglia become overactive, then it can start to actually kill the neurons instead of protecting the neurons. And of course, if microglia are out here killing neurons, that is a degeneration of motor neurons, causing a degeneration of motor functioning. There can also be a buildup of free radicals that damage and destroy the the neurons, or uh, so yes, I'm sorry. So there's a buildup of free radicals that the neurons or astrocytes cannot counter, meaning there's not enough antioxidants in, around, or associated with these cells to combat the presence and action of these oxidants, of these free radicals. The symptoms of ALS include speaking difficulties, dragging the foot, clumsiness, fatigue, coordination issues, muscle twitches, weakness. All of this occurs because the motor neurons can no longer send signals to certain muscles to allow those muscles to work or to work properly. So all of these are basically functions of not getting adequate motor neuron stimulation to different parts of the body. Cognitive function usually remains normal because in ALS, it's not the cognitive neurons that are being affected, it is the motor neurons that are being affected. It's usually fatal within 2 to 5 years. So after a person becomes diagnosed, they usually pass away within 2 to 5 years because of respiratory problems. Remember that the respiratory system has muscles associated with it that helps you to expand the lungs in order to take more air in. So if the motor neurons leading to the respiratory system are damaged or are degenerated, then you won't be able to breathe adequately. And if a person is not able to breathe adequately, then they cannot get enough oxygen to supply to the cells to make ATP, then the person will generally pass away. 10% of cases of ALS are inherited. The other 90% then are because of some genetic damage that may occur in a particular cell. It might be a neuroglial cell. It might be increase in free radicals that damage cells, etc. There's no cure for ALS. The medications that are there are to help slow the progression, but at this point, there's no cure for ALS. Spinal cord injuries. The most common causes of spinal cord injury are workplace injuries as well as motor vehicle accidents, so MVAs. The severity of the spinal cord injury depends on how much damage occurs and where the damage occurs. If the damage occurs higher up in the spinal cord, then you're more likely to get more damage because it's affecting more of the nerves that are coming from the brain stem. Compression or distortion of the spinal cord can result in damage to or death of the neurons that lead to pain, weakness, loss of sensation, and muscular atrophy. Atrophy, A meaning without, trophy is basically a building up of a cell or a tissue. So atrophy would be the degradation of that muscle because it's not getting any or adequate neuronal stimulation. You end up getting all of these problems. So death of the neurons because of damage to or death of the neuron, you can lead to pain, weakness, loss of sensation, loss of muscle stimulation. Remember that the central nervous system neurons do not regenerate, and if they do, science hadn't figured out when or how, what situation it has to be in order for that to happen. Injury to the ascending tract. Remember, these are neurons leading from the receptors from the periphery going up to the brain. This is sensory information. So if during a spinal cord injury, a person gets damage to an ascending tract, then they'll have loss of sensation. If a person has injury to a descending tract, the information coming from the brain to effectors, then that person will have loss of motor function, and they can have any of these happen. Weakness, pain, loss of sensation, and it may end up potentially becoming paralysis, depending on the extent and location of that damage. Research is looking for ways of limiting the damage after injury, meaning when you have an injury, the process of inflammation will pull fluid into the area with all these other cells that help to try to repair the damage of that tissue. After spinal cord injury, the damage in the tissue, the repair of the tissue, the damage of the tissue, uh, all of that can result in the injury. So if research can find a way to limit that damage so that those tissues can try to heal, then the person can those cells can regenerate. At least that's the whole, that's the hope. So they're looking into growth factors, they're looking into stem cells in order to help see if they can figure out ways to make the spinal cord work. I'm sorry, see if they can make the spinal cord work after spinal cord injuries. We're going to stop the video here and continue with the next section on the next video.